A new poll reveals that 57% of Americans believe President Donald Trump is acting too erratically with his economic strategies, particularly his aggressive import tax plan, which has now rattled the stock market, as if you haven't noticed. A third of respondents, here's the poll, it's an IPSOS Reuters poll, a third of respondents feel his actions are acceptable, and a significant 70% now predicting that higher tariffs will drive up costs for everyday items. That could be because they're hearing it in the media, but it comes as Europe and Canada retaliate against Trump's 25% blanket tariff on steel imports. He claims foreign countries have an unfair advantage when it comes to steel. It's led to a torturous week for investors on global markets, particularly the Dow, which has plummeted, also the ASX too. There's a lot of whiplash out there. For more, we're joined at the desk by Jesse Moores from Spatium Capital. Jesse, great to have you here on Ticker.
Thanks for having us, Aaron.
How do you describe the week?
Tumultuous is a really good way to put it, I think, at the moment. We are concerned with the velocity, or I suppose the aggression of which President Trump is putting these tariffs on global markets. I mean, we were reading last night that there's now an attempt to put agriculture tariffs as well for imports from Canada and Mexico. Makes you wonder what's going to happen to the Australian market if that was to hit us. We're a significant beef importer, or exporter rather, to the US. So the sledgehammer approach is interesting. He is a businessman by design, so we do wonder if a lot of this is to bring negotiations to the table for whatever else it is he really wants to discuss. But fickle at the moment, really fickle and hard to understand.
A lot of people describe it as a week of liquidation. Have you been surprised by just how far investors have decided to withdraw?
I think it's concerning because we obviously lived through the COVID period. We lived through 2018 and 19 when you had some murmurings around, World War III potentially with Iran and all the rest of it. These mass liquidity events are often, and I don't want to quote Warren Buffett, but let's use him as a good example. You be greedy when others are fearful and fearful when others are greedy. Let's not forget that the US market printed out an extraordinary result for the S&P 500 last year. The NASDAQ continues to go from strength to strength. I mean, Nvidia being well over a few $1 trillion now, which is extraordinary. Tesla, Meta, Microsoft, all of them are still punching out. It doesn't surprise me that there is a bit of a pullback and a drawdown on the markets as people look to maybe cover some of their downside. Where we would be looking at is that it's probably a little bit too much. Donald Trump, at the end of the day, is a business person, or President Trump, I should say, is a business person. He's got business people in his cabinet, Elon Musk, let's not forget. There will be some agenda here that we can't forecast. So we think the liquidity crunch at the moment is probably a little bit overstated and will no doubt bounce back at some point.
Well, he can't say anything, right? Because if he says this is for this reason, then investors will be saying, and analysts will be saying, well, how long will that take?
Exactly right.
And he's basically said that given the state of the US economy, the trillions of dollars in debt, the massive budget deficit, the constant haranguing over increasing the debt ceiling, that there was no other choice, that this had to be done. He said when he was standing with Elon Musk buying a Tesla, which was odd, but he said there that there's either the easy way or the hard way. He's decided the hard way, but he thinks it'll pay off 20 times. Are investors going to go on for that ride? They don't know what's happening, and we look at Warren Buffett. He seemed to know what was happening. He got out.
Sitting in T-bills, right? It was very, very circumstantial, I think.
Very much so.
Very convenient. But
notice he wasn't standing behind Donald Trump as well at the inauguration.
Notice that. Yeah, very. I found that very peculiar. But I think, look, in that example, right? So let's say it does pay back the American people 20 times. Over what timeline?
Exactly.
20 times over 2 years,
your
5
lifetime,
years, 10 years,
kids'
your
lifetime.
lifetime. Let's not forget the Midwest, which is traditionally the low socioeconomic to mid-low socioeconomic portion of the population, are struggling at the moment, right? The US or the globe is in a cost of living crisis. You've still got sticky inflation. You've got higher interest rates that are driving all of this into a more untenable position for these people. If Donald Trump decides to continue throwing import tariffs on things like agriculture, right? That's where we're starting now to look at, go, all right, so if steel and aluminium are a foregone conclusion, that's done. What's he going to come after next? If he starts to go after agriculture, because the US, let's not forget, doesn't produce enough ag to feed their people, where's he going to source that food production from?
The other issue as well is just because you decide to throw tariffs onto another country's steel and aluminium or agriculture doesn't mean that tomorrow the crop grows in your backyard.
100%. It takes decades, right? Decades to establish that fertile land. And then you do start to wonder, because there's murmurings obviously of how much Bill Gates owns in terms of agricultural land in the US. Is there something here? But I'm not a conspiracy theorist, Aaron, so I
love it. Look at this.
Far.
This is fantastic. No, I mean, this is the problem, right? Is that he says make America great again, but we don't know when.
Exactly.
And
right.
he's a legacy president now. He doesn't want another term. He can't have another term, although I'm sure he'll try and find a way. But he wants to be seen as potentially the president who created the North American United States, right? Canada and Mexico and Greenland, all one big happy country. He's in legacy mode, which means that for investors, when you're dealing with someone who is thinking big picture, what do you do today?
That's where the challenge, I think, has arisen for a lot of fund managers at the moment. They're taking liquidity off the table, they're exiting some of their positions and going, well, where do we deploy the capital? Private credit's had its run and probably still doing okay in some respects. Private assets, though, in your alt space, your PEVC, a lot of that has come to farm, and there's been some concerns around that. Obviously, T-bills have been a good thing for Warren Buffett. I don't know necessarily about the strength of some of the Australian credit in that respect, and government credit. But it is challenging. I mean, investors always want to promote, or rather fund managers always want to promote, 5, 7, 10-year horizon. This is a thematic that we're going to invest in for many, many years to come. But when you've got an erratic president like President Trump, that, as you said, he doesn't have another term to come after this. So he can swing this sledgehammer very, very heavily for the next 4 years.
Can't be voted out.
Can't be voted out. He's got control over the White House. He's got control over the lower house,
Senate,
Congress,
everything.
So
some say the Supreme Court.
But soon to be the Fed as well, no doubt. But you do start to wonder, if he continues to just swing around the way that he is with this sledgehammer, there is going to be very few spots to hide, aside from what he might know.
The other aspect to all of this is geopolitics. So we're talking about Trump's actions and what he is starting, but the rest of the world isn't just sitting around waiting, right? We are seeing retaliatory efforts, but obviously we saw inflation spike because of COVID. We saw inflation also continue to spike because of the Ukraine-Russia war. If Russia comes back to the table, commodity prices will be in all sorts, because all of a sudden all of these Russian commodities will be available to the West, and that will push things around as well. It's going to be a pretty unpredictable year.
Very unpredictable. Commodities might have a good run if that comes to fruition, just purely because that volatility back in the mix. There might be some dancing around in some of the precious metal space. We know now in hindsight, after looking back at the attempt, and he might still bring it back again, but the attempt to try and take over Greenland is largely pushed for their precious metals that they've got exposure to. We know about 90-95% of those controlled by the Chinese.
You don't set up tomorrow and start producing the day after.
Exactly right. So you're looking at decade-long projects that, again, by the time you get there, let's also not forget mining is not something that you can suddenly start digging and you hit the jackpot, right? That takes years and years and years. Yeah. And the forecasts are forecasts at best. The geology is not always perfect in terms of what we think the deposits are. So if you're talking about decades-long attempts to try and bring, make America great again, or get some more control back over the global economy, that's a long timeline to be invested for.
I was speaking to someone earlier who was talking about the act back in the 1930s that led to the global depression and the concern about trade tariffs. Is this a repeat of that? We've had the kind of booming 20s, so to speak. The last few years, surprisingly, have been booming post-COVID. Are you that concerned?
I wouldn't say we're that concerned. I would say that whilst past performance is not an indicator of the future, past human performance...
Sound like a superannuation.
We've heard enough of them, I tell you that much. But human condition can tend to repeat itself in certain manifestations. And I think it's a nature of our psyche to look for patterns and go, well, the 20s and the 20s, that makes sense, and potentially entering the 30s and the 30s, and is a World War III coming along? So it is easy to make those connections. There are some concerning trends that we are seeing be repeated, but at the end of the day, I think what it's going to come down to is governments. So the Australian government, if we look at ours in isolation right now, I think we've been very, very comfortable for very, very long using China as a major
we've had China buy from us, and we've lived under the shadow of protection of the United States.
Right.
How's that going right now?
We've allowed them to come in and use our defence resources, and we do joint exercises with them. You can only play both sides for so long until someone goes, well, you're a fence sitter, you have to pick one or the other. I think whatever's going to happen at the federal level, probably not this next term, whoever the Prime Minister becomes, Albanese or Dutton, but I think there's going to be a few interesting terms coming up for Australia from a geopolitical sense. We're going to have to really think strategically around how our alignment's going to work. And if we're going to be punished...
Do you think we'll have a choice, or do you think we'll be told?
I think we're going to have a choice. I don't think we can afford to play both sides anymore, or in that...
But I mean, obviously, for security, we look towards AUKUS.
Sure.
A couple of weeks ago, the President was asked about AUKUS and he didn't know what it was, and that's Australia's great hope. We ditched the French, and that didn't exactly go down well for submarines to be built, but these Virginia-class submarines, the US can't build them for themselves, let alone peel 3 off for us, right?
Yeah.
And then on the other side, you've got China, and they obviously aren't having a great relationship, despite Albanese's best attempts. And our biggest client to have that concern, the hope during COVID was to decouple ourselves from just China and look to other markets, including the US. How's that looking?
Well, it hasn't been looking great. That's part of the problem. I think there's going to have to be a revision as to how we operate in a global trade environment. India is an emerging market that's buying more and more commodities every day. Obviously, they tend to be lower grade commodities in terms of grade 3 coal and some of those type of resources. They are a huge consumer of agricultural products as well, which is something that we could look at more broadly. I do think, though, we are hitting a critical point where Australia can't afford to be just the lazy about, like the lackadaisical, she'll be right, we'll work it out kind of operator. We go and do work in Singapore, and there is a familiarity and a comfort in that demeanour, but at the same time we need to, I think, re-establish what we stand for.
It's such a good point. I'm actually kind of scared about Australia's future at the moment in that regard, right? So we have decided to not go ahead. We'll talk about security first, and then we'll talk about the economy. We decided to not go ahead with the French submarines because of the cost. Got an even costlier deal with the United States and the UK. $500 billion now for submarines, and we need a nuclear facility that we don't actually have. We don't even have a nuclear industry to get these nuclear subs up and running or to build them ourselves. That is so far away at a time where you've got Chinese warships circling and doing live fire rounds off the coast of Australia without telling the Australian government what they're up to, right? Then on the economic front, in the OECD, Australia is the least sophisticated economy of the entire OECD. We just dig it up and send it offshore to the country that is our biggest geopolitical foe. We've played the middle road now for such a long time, but our big brother, the US, isn't following along. And despite all of our efforts to go off to wars that they want us to go to,
the ANZUS Treaty in 2001 was
we are not going to get special treatment when it comes to tariffs. And as you've just said, this could just be the beginning. What's the outlook look like for Australia?
I think we speak about this a lot at the moment with a lot of our clients, a lot of our stakeholders. I think what Australia is crying out for is conviction. We need to be a country of conviction. The leaders need to be convicted, the voters need to be convicted, and we need to actually see policy come through. We need to see negotiations at a diplomatic level come through, at a level that Australia's, put it this way to you, Aaron, you're never going to please everyone, right? And I think our current Prime Minister, and this is not an advocacy for either party, but our current Prime Minister is learning that the hard way.
But neither party seems to be pleasing anybody.
No, exactly
Story
right.
in the Australian this week, which is more of a conservative newspaper in Australia, suggests that backbenchers for the Liberals are concerned that Peter Dutton, the opposition leader, the Liberal leader, doesn't actually have any big agenda. There's no policies being put forward that is what the alternative would be to get Australia's economy moving. You have a look at what Anthony Albanese's team are doing. They're not really coming up with much either. So Australians have a choice, but what's the choice?
Well, I think that's part of the problem, is the constituency. We as a people need to start recognising ourselves what it is we're voting for, and having the conviction behind who we're voting for, what we want them to actually do. Let's be realistic. Federal elections haven't had. It's never been, since the John Howard era, federal elections have not been the parties to win, it's the parties to lose at the end of the day. Right now, and I'm not going to make a political forecast because that's just fraught with danger, but right now we're seeing effectively the Liberal Party using every opportunity to tell everyone why that Labor should lose. They're not telling everyone why you should vote for Liberal, they're just saying why Labor should not be voted for, why they should lose. And Labor, at the other hand, are probably scrambling a little bit, trying to say, well, this is what we've done, knowing now that they look back and they go, well, we actually haven't achieved as much as we sought out to achieve. There's been some positives though, like they have made some good transitions to moving a lot of the energy off grid into green power, which is good. I think it's like a 40% rate. So there's positives there, but then you've got to ask the questions around, well, what's their marketing team doing to tell the Australian population this is the advancements we're making?
When also people are noticing their power prices are going up.
Do you know, and it's all become cyclical, right? Everything starts to feed off one another. So if we bring it back to the broader concerns around tariffs and what's happening in the US, as I said earlier, we're now pivoting to looking at agriculture and going, well, what impact is that going to have if we suddenly see a 20-25% tariff on Aussie exports into the US, predominantly cattle or predominantly beef? Us in Canada, 23% of the US import market in terms of beef, 14% then comes from Mexico. So those top three there are the three that are currently sort of being obviously targeted with some of these tariffs. So it's going to be an interesting position for us at the bargaining table to say, right, well, if this is going to start to happen, how are you going to start to feed your population? Let's not forget they're one of the biggest consumers of beef patties for obvious reasons,
yes,
right? So
yes.
there's a couple of dynamics here that this sledgehammer, again, that I come back to with Trump, might do a lot of damage early on, and then suddenly the party's going to take a deep breath, step back and go, oh, well, we actually probably needed that wall that we smashed down. Let's start rebuilding it.
And we can't underestimate just what the response will be from Americans.
Exactly.
That will obviously worry him as well. Anyway, we better leave it there. Jesse Moores from Spatium Capital. Really appreciate your time here
Thanks,
in Ticker.
Aaron.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.